Hello, statistics students. Welcome to another video on using the linear model. Example 1. Education spending. Is there a correlation between state and federal spending on education? The following output shows the regression analysis on state and federal spending on education from a sample of states. Assume the conditions for the linear regression model are satisfied. Show all 4 steps of the hypothesis test. So to show that there's a correlation between state and federal spending on education, we would need to do a hypothesis test on whether or not the slope of the regression line is 0. So to test whether there's a correlation or association between state and federal spending on education, we test whether the slope of the regression line is 0. Usually, we would begin with a scatter plot to make sure there were no unusual observations, and as a preliminary check that the association between these variables is linear. However, the problem's statement tells us to assume that the conditions for the linear regression model hold, so we proceed accordingly. So step 1 is to state the hypothesis. And the null hypothesis is that the slope is 0, or there is no association or correlation. And the alternative is the slope is not 0, and there is association or correlation. So step 2, we'll do a t-test for slope. And as always, we do hypothesis test at the significance level of alpha equal to 0.05. So using the output from a statistical calculator for slope, we see the second line has slope, and we see a test statistic or a t-stat of 13.560894 in yellow. So we'll use 13.56, and they go ahead and give us our p-value of less than 0.0001. So we know that that's a very small p-value as indicated by the very large test statistic. Therefore, since the p-value is much less than 0.05, we reject the null in favor of the alternative. Therefore, in this case, we do have sufficient evidence to conclude that the slope is not 0, which means we have sufficient evidence to conclude that there is a linear association between state and federal spending on education. Now, keep in mind that this was a test that the slope was not 0. If you wish to test a value other than 0 in the null hypothesis, you may need to do so by hand, since some statistical software packages don't support testing any other value other than 0. StatCrunch does support this feature, but it's instructive to see how to carry out such tests by hand. And in the next example, we'll revisit the Vitruvian man, who hypothesized that the arm span length is equal to the height. So this Vitruvian man in the next example is going to provide us with a useful example of when we're testing that the slope is something other than 0. And this concludes this video on using the linear model example 1.